60 or 80 or 100 years ago, there was a certain romance about travel that just doesn't exist today. It was a big deal to go someplace. These days we think nothing of hopping in our car and driving all day or flying all day and ending up someplace thousands of miles from where we started. Our forebears from decades ago didn't have that sort of experience. For them, the very names of the passenger trains connoted unique and faraway places, romantic places. And so in the Southwest, Santa Fe played very heavily upon that Native American mystique with names like the Super Chief and El Capitan. Northern Pacific had a train called the North Coast Limited that just has a certain resonance about it. There was nothing like this urban sophistication and swankiness of the 20th Century Limited.
These are just a few examples of the rich history of railroading in America. Hi, I'm Tia Marlier. Let's explore the story of passenger trains in America. Welcome to America and the Passenger Train. The first passenger train can be traced to England in 1825. Locomotive number 1, the Locomotion, hauled 588 passengers seated on wooden planks from the mining town of Darlington to the riverbanks of Stockton-on-Tees. However, it didn't take long for America to catch the railroad fever. In 1830, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad operated the first scheduled rail passenger service between Baltimore and Ellicott's Mills, Maryland. A year later, on August 9, 1831, a Mohawk and Hudson passenger train operated its first journey between Albany and Schenectady, New York, a distance of 18.2 miles in 46 minutes. Passenger cars on those early railroads were either wagons or stagecoaches, built of wood and fitted with flanged wheels. They didn't go very fast, nor did they ride very well. All that was to change in a few years with faster trains that reached into every city and hamlet in the country. Even today, traveling by rail has a fascination. Why do Americans still love trains? Railroads have always had a romance about them. Perhaps it's the sound of the rails beneath your car as you traverse miles across our country. Or maybe railroads have always represented modern technology, from wooden to steel cars or steam engines to modern diesel locomotives that pull sleek, streamlined trains. Trains have been romanticized through the years in movies and Broadway shows. Popular songs like Orange Blossom Special, City of New Orleans, Rock Island Line, or Chattanooga Choo Choo are just a few examples of train lore that has captured our imagination in music. Indeed, the names of the trains themselves evoke excitement. Panama Limited, Empire Builder, 20th Century Limited, Broadway Limited, Super Chief, California Zephyr, Olympian Hiawatha, or Daylight, to name a few. Those were the days when people dressed for travel, and part of the excitement was the journey itself. Later, we'll take a brief look at some of those trains we just mentioned. As a nation, we were often connected by rail lines. In years past, the American passenger train was the only public transportation offered to cities, towns, and villages. This is still the case today in some of our rural areas, where neither bus nor plane service is available. Remember the driving of the Golden Spike? That's considered the greatest historical event in transcontinental travel. It occurred at Promontory, Utah on May 10, 1869. This joining of the rails between the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads was the beginning of coast-to-coast rail passenger service. Only a few years after the driving of the Golden Spike, new trains caught the traveling public's fancy with names like Overland Limited, Sunset Limited, Royal Blue, the Fast Mail, and Florida Special. Passenger rail cars, which were first made of wood, now were made of steel. They not only rode better, they were safer too. Once coast-to-coast service was offered, sleeping cars became a necessity. A major operator of sleeping cars was the Pullman Company. Incorporated as the Pullman Palace Car Company, it ran sleeping car service on nearly every famous train in the country.
At its peak in the 1920s, Pullman was handling about 100,000 people a night aboard its cars. And from that point forward, the traffic began to erode, mainly through the Great Depression of the 30s And then there was a surge, of course, during World War II with the hauling of hundreds of thousands of troops. But after the war, the decline continued under the pressure of increased air service and expanded highways. And by the 1960s, Pullman was handling just a fraction of the passenger loads that it had been handling back in the 20s.
Sadly, the era of Pullman-operated sleeping cars came to an end on the eve of December 31st, 1968. Bill Howes explains.
During this period, the railroads were looking very hard at whether or not the Pullman operation was profitable for themselves. And one by one, the railroads began to pull out of Pullman. The most notable example of that was the New York Central in the 1950s when they decided that they were going to operate their own sleeping cars. By the late 1960s, several major railroads had decided that they were going to pull out of Pullman. This resulted in the Pullman Company faced with a problem of efficiency in handling the remaining railroads. And by the middle of 1968, Pullman advised the railroads that it could no longer efficiently operate sleeping car services under contract to them, and therefore it would be closing down its operations at the end of 1968.
While Pullman sleeping cars ran on the rails for over a century, another much shorter service lasted a little over a year. Steve Patterson provides some details.
Only a few years before that had been streamlined trains. The Pennsylvania and the Santa Fe Railroad teamed up with Transcontinental Air Transport, later became TWA, to provide coast-to-coast travel in less than 48 hours. And that was made possible by combining train and air passenger service, an idea which was promoted by Charles Lindbergh. It began on July 7th, 1929. Passengers boarded the Airways Limited at New York's Penn Station for a nighttime journey across the Alleghenies. The following morning, passengers continued on board Ford Trimotors, flying across the Midwest during the day and ending in Oklahoma. Passengers would then board a Santa Fe train for a night's travel across the plains and desert to New Mexico. The last leg of the journey to Los Angeles was by plane. The rail air service ended 15 months later when the Great Depression caused declining ridership.
A decade earlier, in 1920, rail passenger traffic reached a peak of 47 billion passenger miles. New trains with romantic names like Columbine, Daylight Limited, The Chief, and Empire Builder helped spur this dramatic growth. However, railroads were going to face a challenge. During the 1930s and the years of the Depression, railroads sought to maintain and modernize their trains in order to attract and keep passengers. While air service was in its infancy, the automobile and new highways were cutting into passenger volume. Railroads countered with new, exciting, streamlined trains that caught the public's fancy. The Burlington Railroad introduced a new fleet of Zephyrs.